Hello there. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Frank Stritter. I'm a retired faculty member from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and a U.S. Army veteran. I'm also a member of VFW Post 8866 on Holden Beach, North Carolina. And today they were intending to hold a commemoration for the December 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor. That was 79 years ago. But due to our pandemic restrictions, we've decided to post it on YouTube and hope that our VFW Post and anyone else who sees it is impressed by the commemorative aspects of it. The topic today is, were the commanders at Pearl Harbor, who were Admiral Kimmel and General Short, negligent or scapegoated? "79 years ago, on 7 December 1941, the skies over the U.S. Naval Base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, filled with a drone of more than 350 Japanese fighter planes and bombers. During the 2-hour sunrise attack that followed, the Japanese strike force rained fire on the unprepared U.S. Pacific Fleet, destroying or damaging some 20 ships, 200 aircraft, and inflicting 3,500 casualties. Now, this presentation today is in honor of those casualties and a question to the viewer as to whether either of the commanders at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Kimmel or General Short, should have received the punishment they received. Prior to the attack, Germany was battering Great Britain and France in 1939 and 1940. President Roosevelt feared, and rightly so, that an unchecked Germany would conquer all of Europe and potentially plunge the world into a nightmare. He thought that Britain and France alone could not stop Germany. As history has shown, he was correct. President Roosevelt was a good friend of Prime Minister Winston Churchill and wanted to help him and our European allies. He planned to involve the U.S. in the European conflict as quickly as possible. The attack on Pearl Harbor almost ruined this. If Hitler had not declared war on the U.S., it would have been almost impossible to have persuaded Congress to declare war on both Germany and Japan at the same time, since Japan was the only nation who had actually attacked the U.S. up to that point. The American people did not want to go to war. A Gallup poll taken at the time showed that 88% of all Americans opposed U.S. involvement in the European war, and Congress could at best be described as isolationist. Publicly, President Roosevelt agreed, saying in a 1940 election year speech, "I have said this before, but I shall say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars." But privately, the president planned the opposite. He shipped military materials to the European allies of the U.S. in the Atlantic Ocean and prepared to defend the U.S. against Germany. He seemed far less interested in providing an adequate defense against Japan in the Pacific Ocean. The U.S. knew about Japan's aggression in Asia and the Pacific Ocean, but was in no position to do battle against what was then a superior Japanese fleet. In the summer of 1940, the president moved the base of the Pacific Fleet from San Diego to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. His rationale was that a U.S. presence in Hawaii would deter Japan from any attack on U.S. installations in the Pacific. Admiral James Richardson, who was then the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet at the time, recognized how vulnerable the fleet would be in such an exposed and remote location as Hawaii and objected to the move. He believed, I didn't just object, he objected strongly. He believed that there would be a logistical nightmare that was worsened by the slim resources available, the lack of preparation and organization that had been provided to the fleet. He believed that Pearl Harbor could not provide an adequate defense against either air and or naval attacks. He also believed that the fleet's presence at Pearl Harbor would not deter Japan from attacking Pearl Harbor. The president responded by firing Richardson on 1 February 1941. The president further weakened the Pacific Fleet by transferring 41 ships to the Atlantic Fleet in April of 1941, including the carrier Yorktown and her escort group, and 3 battleships to help protect the shipment of war supplies to Britain. This also meant that the president and his naval commanders believed that the focus of the US naval power was to be in the Atlantic, not the Pacific. This gave Japan a 2-to-1 advantage in naval strength over our Pacific Fleet at the time of its attack on Pearl Harbor. So the US was not prepared for any naval offensive in the Western Pacific. Attack was not part of its mission. Defense was part of its mission, however, but even mounting an adequate defense would have been very difficult. And then there was our intelligence. During the late 1930s and early 1940s, as Arthur Prang wrote in his book, Pearl Harbor, The Verdict of History, a considerable amount of discussion had occurred in Washington amongst the various intelligence circles about both the intentions and the capabilities of the Japanese Navy. Japan had sent many signals in the late 1930s, 1940, and early 1941 that had been interpreted by US intelligence in a variety of ways. There were many rumors out there that Japan was likely to make a strike against the US somewhere in the Pacific. There were a lot of dots out there, but no one seemed to be connecting them. According to Secretary of War Henry Stimson, key players in the Roosevelt administration held a closed-door meeting at the White House on 25 December 1941. Stimson then wrote in his diary, "This discussion was about how we should maneuver to force the Japanese to fire the first shot, and while not exposing ourselves to too great a danger, this will be a difficult task." So what do you think? Was there a predetermined plan to push Japan into war? Admiral Kelly Turner, Director of War Plans in the Office of Naval Operations, was close to connecting the dots. Turner seemed to have a better grasp of the Japanese intentions than anyone else, and estimated an attack on Pearl Harbor to be a 50-50 probability. To me, that sounds like a good possibility. Turner elected not to send specific details of the intercepted Japanese diplomatic communications that pointed strongly to an attack on Pearl Harbor. He had decided not to send those to the commanders at Pearl Harbor. He did, however, draft strong war warnings memos that were to be sent to Pacific commanders on 27 November. But he then softened the language considerably before the memos were sent. In retrospect, maybe intelligence did know something, and Turner was probably the one who should have been more specific and more direct about the situation. The commanders at Pearl Harbor. 2 individuals were in command of US forces at Pearl Harbor on that fateful day. They were Husband E. Kimmel, who's on the far right of this photo, He's a rear admiral who had succeeded Admiral Richardson as commander of the U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet. And on the far left, Walter C. Short, a lieutenant general who was in command of the U.S. Army's Hawaiian Command. Admiral Kimmel had enjoyed a successful military career, beginning with his graduation from the Naval Academy in 1904, and then his service in 1915 as an aide to then Secretary of the Navy, Franklin D. Roosevelt. That name sound familiar? He served on battleships in World War I and then various naval positions between the wars. In 1940, Kimmel was in command of a cruiser squadron at Pearl Harbor. In February 1941, he was promoted to Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, replacing Admiral James Richardson, who Roosevelt had fired. Kimmel agreed with his predecessor about the deficiencies of Pearl Harbor as the base for the fleet and informed Roosevelt of his feelings, but he wasn't nearly as vocal as Richardson. He accepted the command anyway, trusting that Washington would notify him of any intelligence predicting an attack. This proved to be misplaced trust. If Kimmel had any weakness, it was that he was a creature of habit, of routine. He practiced basically what had been done before and lacked any imagination. He had little insight regarding unprecedented information and events. Kimmel had heard that negotiations between the U.S. and Japan about the U.S. opposition to Japanese aggression in the Far East had floundered in Washington. Still, he took no exemplary defensive actions at Pearl Harbor. In fact, he believed that any strike that was to occur would be more likely at Wake or Midway Islands or the Philippines. He felt he had addressed that possibility in April 1941 by requesting extra anti-aircraft artillery to support those attacks from General Short. Short had denied the request on the grounds that no additional resources could be spared. Kimmel was sent a war warning memo on 27 November by Admiral Stark, the Chief of Naval Operations, that predicted an amphibious operation against either the Philippines, the Kra Peninsula, or possibly Borneo, and directed Kimmel to assume an appropriate defensive deployment preparatory to carrying out the tasks assigned to him in War Plan number 46. That plan called for him to keep the Japanese fleet engaged in the Marshall Islands if war were to break out. Kimmel did not place the fleet on alert at that time. His critics asserted that he should have, because he had been ordered to initiate a defensive deployment of the fleet in the war warning memo that he had received on 27 November. From that memo, Kimmel, however, concluded that the main threat to the fleet was sabotage from the large ethnic Japanese population in Hawaii, and that much of the fleet should therefore be kept in port, moored closely together in Battleship Row, where it could be more easily guarded. Such an alignment proved, however, to be exactly what those pilots of the Japanese torpedo bombers wanted. Kimmel's staff had calculated in early 1941 that a 360-degree patrol in the air around Hawaii, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, would provide sufficient warning, and estimated that a minimum of 250 PBY Catalina reconnaissance aircraft were needed to make it happen. Early in 1941, Kimmel had therefore requested enough Catalinas to bring the total available to him up to that number, 250. His superiors responded that it was not possible, but did promise to send him 100. Not one of those 100 had been delivered by the end of 1941. Kimmel did have 64 Catalinas available at the end of 1941, but he had temporarily assigned 24 of them to Midway for its reconnaissance purposes. So he had less than 1/5 of the Catalinas that his staff believed he needed to undertake the reconnaissance they recommended around Hawaii. Kimmel's planes did search more than 2 million square miles of the Pacific during the week prior to the attack on 7 December, but never saw the Japanese fleet. That was less than 1/3 of the 360-degree arc around Hawaii. And his own intelligence staff had advised him incorrectly that he should concentrate on the southwest. The Japanese attacked from the east. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who replaced Kimmel as commander of the Pacific Fleet in 1941, stated in 1964 that it was a blessing that Kimmel had no advance warning of the attack. Nimitz believed that if Kimmel had been aware of the impending attack, he would have taken his fleet out to sea to intercept the Japanese fleet. Nimitz believed that the fleet would never have been gotten within shooting range of the Japanese fleet, and that much of the American fleet would have been sunk in deep water, costing perhaps 10,000 more lives than were lost on 7 December. In the aftermath following the attack, President Roosevelt relieved Admiral Kimmel of his command of the Pacific Fleet and reduced him from a 4-star rank to a 2-star rank of Rear Admiral. He avoided a court-martial when he requested and took early retirement in 1942. Kimmel passed away in 1968. General Walter C. Short had a long career in the U.S. Army, serving admirably. He earned his commission in 1902 and then fought in World War I on the general staff of the 1st Infantry Division and then of 3rd Army. Short commanded the 1st Infantry Division and then both the 4th Army Corps and 1st Army Corps before being assigned to be commanding general of the Hawaiian Department on 8 February 1941. As a lieutenant general in charge of the Army operations at Pearl Harbor, Short believed that his position was primarily for training. From the information available to him at the time, he had decided that it was extremely unlikely that the Japanese would ever attack Hawaii. The first warning to the Hawaiian Department that Japan had determined upon a new course of aggressive action was sent from the War Department on 7 July 1941. In late July, and just before President Roosevelt placed new U.S. economic sanctions on Japan, which motivated them to war even more so, General Short received a second warning, this time with advice that while no immediate military retaliation by Japan was anticipated, the Hawaiian commander should take appropriate precautionary measures. The general did so by ordering a full alert of his forces, in marked contrast to the lesser action taken by him after the War Warnings memo on 27 November 1941. When questioned about the alert by the press, Short explained that his forces were only taking to the field for 10 days of maneuvers. After just a few days, Short called off the maneuvers, but he left 24-hour guards at military and public utility installations, highway bridges, and along the the Honolulu waterfront to protect those locations against sabotage. On 26 November, Secretary of War Stimson requested that the Office of the Army Chief of Staff send another war warning memo to all Army commanders in the Pacific region. This was the same one that Kimmel had received. The message instructed commanders to both undertake such measures as you deem necessary and not, repeat, not to alarm civilian population or disclose your intent. It also stated that the United States desires that Japan commit the first overt act. The 27 November warning was certainly vague in recommending a specific course of action to field commanders. Even so, Short misinterpreted it, concluding that it was once again only a warning to guard against sabotage by local Japanese sympathizers. Short had a radar system, but failed to use it effectively. The Hawaiian Command had recently installed 7 radar installations in various locations around Oahu, employing a new radar technology that operators were just beginning to use. One of those was on the northern tip of Oahu. Short, however, was not yet integrated them into his reconnaissance system. 2 privates in training were operating the single radar system that was operational early in the morning of 7 December and did sight the attacking Japanese aircraft at 0702. Actually, they were supposed to shut down at 0700 to go back for breakfast, but the breakfast truck was late, so they left their radar on and did happen to see the Japanese planes. The 2 privates forwarded a message reporting their sighting to the Fighter Information Center at Fort Schaffer in Honolulu. And the duty officer, who was also an inexperienced second lieutenant, who was also in training, received it. The duty officer was not able to distinguish between friendly and enemy aircraft and concluded that the sighting was a flight of B-17s coming in from the mainland. He told the radar operators simply to not worry about it and to ignore their sighting. Short also ordered the Army Air Corps fighter aircraft at both Hickam and Wheeler Army airfields to be parked from wingtip to wingtip, meaning they looked like they were on display. Because of the focus on potential sabotage, he had placed guards around the perimeters of the airfields and lined them up in tight rows that could easily be protected against sabotage. Unfortunately, this made them an easy target for the Japanese bombers and resulted in destruction or damage to 328 of the 402 U.S. planes on the ground. Only 8 U.S. planes were successful getting into the air that morning. 7 forts had been built around the island in which the coastal artillery had deployed its artillery to defend the harbor and the fleet anchored there. Soldiers manning that artillery had been equipped and then trained to repel attacking battleships. Their cannon were pointed out to sea and were incapable of shooting down approaching aircraft since they only could be raised 20 degrees, the effective angle for engaging approaching ships. The Army also had some anti-aircraft artillery, and a few of the gunners attempted to engage the Japanese planes. They were not effective as their guns were not in conducive firing locations, and their ammunition was locked in a magazine a short distance away. It took them a while, but some guns did eventually start firing. After the attack, Short was accused of dereliction of duty and reduced in rank from his temporary rank of lieutenant general to his permanent rank of major general. He was forced to retire in February 1942 and then died in 1949. After the attack, there were numerous investigations, all of which blamed Admiral Kimmel and General Short for various degrees of dereliction of duty, being caught unaware at Pearl Harbor, and not making adequate preparation to defend the Pacific Fleet against attack. On 16 December 1941, President Roosevelt appointed the Roberts Commission to investigate the events leading up to the defeat at Pearl Harbor, and then, without waiting for its report, relieved both Kimmel and Short of their commands on 18 December. On 24 January 1942, the Roberts Commission reported, accused General Short and Admiral Kimmel of being unprepared, and charged them with dereliction of duty. The commission was not a typical courts-martial proceedings, as it allowed no sworn testimony, no due process, no witnesses to be called by either man in his own defense, and no right of either to cross-examine witnesses. Admiral Stanley, who had served as a member of the commission, later disavowed the report, maintaining that these two officers were martyred, and saying that if they had been brought to that trial, they both would have been cleared of any charge. In 1944, during a Department of the Navy inquiry into the incident, Captain Lawrence Safford, who was the leading cryptologist responsible for decoding intercepted Japanese messages, testified on what he knew, saying, "On December 1, 1941, we had definite information from 3 independent sources that Japan was going to attack Britain and the United States. On December 4, 1941, we received definite information from 2 more independent sources that Japan would attack the United States and Britain and would maintain peace with Russia." Interesting. "We also received positive information that Japan would declare war against the United States at a time to be specified thereafter. This information was positive and unmistakable and was made available to the U.S. Army intelligence at the same time. All decoded messages," Safford explained, "were promptly passed on to the President and other key civilian and military personnel. Yet both Kimmel and Short were not told about the most pertinent of these messages." In 1955, Kimmel published an as told to autobiography entitled Admiral Kimmel's Story, in which he stated that he believed President Roosevelt had sacrificed him and his career to take suspicion off himself. Kimmel believed that President Roosevelt knew Pearl Harbor was going to be attacked, although no evidence has ever been cited to support that suggestion. Kimmel also concluded that officers in Washington, not he and Short, should have borne the lion's share of the blame for the surprise of the attack. He also wrote that Washington had failed to pass along intelligence pointing to Pearl Harbor as a likely target. Hesitation and incompetence in the final hours before the attack, including that of General Stark, the Chief of Naval Operations, meant that a last-minute warning did not reach Kimmel until 8 hours after the attack began. In 1995, Senator Strom Thurmond, the chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, at the encouragement of the families of both Kimmel and Short, requested that the Department of Defense, rather than the supposedly biased Departments of Army or Navy, undertake yet another inquiry into Pearl Harbor. This report resulted in the Dorn Report that cited the failure of General Marshall and Admiral Stark in Washington to transmit to Kimmel and Short intelligence reports they had based on intercepted Japanese messages, and to convey the sense of urgency that those communications should have engendered. Despite this criticism, the report also supported the Roberts Commission's findings that 2 commanders were largely responsible for the disaster by their failure to make adequate preparations in light of the information they had, and did not recommend that their ranks be restored posthumously. However, 4 years later, on May 25th, 1999, The U.S. Senate passed a resolution by a vote of 52 to 47 that Kimmel and Short had performed their duties competently and professionally. How about that? That our losses at Pearl Harbor were not the result of their dereliction of duty, and requested that President to posthumously restore both men to full rank. Senator Roth of Delaware said they were denied vital intelligence that was available in Washington. Senator Thurmond of South Carolina called Kimmel and Short the two final victims of Pearl Harbor. President Clinton, who was president at that time, did not act on that resolution, nor have any of his successors since that time. The issue seems to have died. In 2016, the Kimmel family erected a statue of Admiral Kimmel on the waterfront in Kimmel's hometown, Henderson, Kentucky, in his honor. My conclusions, and you do not have to agree with them, of course, are: first, the decision to move the Pacific Fleet from San Diego to Hawaii was most likely a mistake. None of the infrastructure was adequate at Pearl Harbor, and as a matter of fact, Admiral Richardson, Kimmel's predecessor as commander of the fleet, was relieved of his command over his protest of that very decision. Second, the war warnings memos issued by the Chief of Naval Operations and the Army Chief of Staff on 27 November 1941 were indeed vague. Those orders probably contributed to Kimmel's decision to group his ships in port and Short's decision to group his aircraft on the airfields, making them easier targets. Both commanders reported to Washington the actions they had taken, but if their response to the war warnings was deemed insufficient, their superiors in Washington said nothing. Third, what is now clear is that Washington knew an attack was imminent within 1 week to 10 days after they sent those war warnings to the commanders on 27 November. Yet there were no additional warnings sent to the commanders at Pearl Harbor. And historians have since faulted the Roosevelt administration for not making it clear to the commanders that Pearl Harbor was more than a likely target. Fourth, the potential of naval aviation in 1941 was grossly underrated at the time by virtually every American military expert. Many Japanese admirals, including Admiral Nagumo, the fleet commander, had even opposed the attack on the basis that naval aircraft would never be able to decisively defeat a land or surface force. The only one who knew better was the attack's architect, Admiral Yamamoto. Fifth, some Roosevelt-hating historians have suggested that he knew where and when the Japanese attack would occur and deliberately withheld this information from Kimmel and Short to ensure a Japanese attack and ultimately throw the U.S. into World War II. Roosevelt did expect an attack by the Japanese somewhere in the Pacific, but conspiracy theories examining that he knew that they were going to strike Pearl Harbor have been rejected by most historians since. There is evidence that Roosevelt, Stark, and Marshall were as shocked as anyone else when Pearl Harbor was attacked, although they likely did not regret the subsequent U.S. entry into the war. They wanted that. Whatever the truth may be on this point, it cannot be denied that Washington did watch Japan as it prepared for the attack and kept Kimmel and Short out of much of the intelligence loop that it had. Finally, in the years since the attack, historians have found less fault with Short and Kimmel than did the various investigating commissions that did not recommend restating the ranks of the two commanders. As Prang concluded in his extensive history of the attack, one can sympathize with the two commanders, understand their decisions or lack of them, and agree that officials in Washington did not provide them with all the intelligence they had at the time. They were competent leaders, however, who made the best decisions they could with the information they had. But the two did fail in putting an adequate defense of Pearl Harbor together. What they did was not enough to prepare for that day of infamy. It's probably true that neither Kimmel or Short had more reason than anyone else to believe Pearl Harbor was a target for the Japanese. Matter of fact, they had less. The American public, however, was screaming. The government and military hierarchies did not want any of the blame. Scapegoats had to be found, and sadly, Kimmel and Short were it. Thank you. And now, what is your response to that question? Do you think that Admiral Kimmel and General Short were unfairly prosecuted and punished for their activities and their beliefs and their actions in preparing for the attack on Pearl Harbor? Or do you think they got what they deserved? Thank you for tuning in today. And I hope that we can all commemorate one more day of Pearl Harbor.